sound of music and the power in the storm. You're my mother and my father, my companion and my friend. You're my comfort in the darkness. You're the voice within the wind. You've shown endless compassion, such mercy and such grace, the wonder of forgiveness and the beauty of your face. You are the master of this world, yet go beyond both time and space, beyond the ever infinite, still filling every space. Your love gives me the wings to fly through each and every day, and the strength for every moment that I meet along the way. No matter where I am or even where I'll be, the thing that really matters is you're right here next to me, next to me, next to me.
Good morning, everyone. This rainy Sunday. So, Happy New Year also. I'll be speaking today on the topic infinite fades, infinite paths. Many of you are probably regular visitors here, devotees, and so you have studied some of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, his life. So many of you will know that one of the keynotes, perhaps the keynote of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, is the harmony of religions. But I find that many people tend to leave it at that and say, yeah, we accept all religions. Followers, devotees in our tradition, even monks, some monks in our tradition, we say, yes, we accept all religions. But then they don't pursue the follow-up questions. Well, in what sense? In what sense are all the different religions equally valid paths to the same goal? Are some somehow closer to the goal than other religions, or are they really put on an equal footing? If they're put on an equal footing, how? How do we explain that philosophically? How do we understand that theologically? So I think there are a lot of unanswered questions that require some really deep thinking and study. And so I want to encourage us to begin to explore in a little bit more depth and detail exactly how Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the different religious and spiritual paths that we find throughout the world. I'm not able to move forward on the slides. So I'm hitting the arrows, but they're not... Oh, now they're working. Okay. Yes, now it's working. Okay. Okay. So just as kind of background, which many of you already know, Sri Ramakrishna was an unusual saint in many respects, but one of the reasons that he was so unusual is that he practiced many different spiritual paths, not only within Hinduism, but also in Christianity and Islam. And he realized God through all of these different paths. God in different forms and in different aspects, but the same God. And I really think this might be unprecedented, that he had numerous types of spiritual experiences, both theistic and non-theistic. What do I mean by theistic? It means the experience of some form of the personal God. What do I mean by the personal God? This is a kind of a technical term in philosophy of religion and theology. It does not mean God in the form of a human being. That's an incarnation. That's a kind of separate concept. But the personal God is God with the omni attributes. Omni attributes means God is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, all-loving, perfect, ethically perfect, perfectly moral, and somebody, a supreme person who's responsive to our prayers. If we're praying to God and God is not personal, then God is not going to listen to our prayers and God is not going to be able to respond to our prayers. But if God is personal, God will be able to listen to our prayers and respond to our prayers. That's the idea. So that's the idea behind a personal God. So Sri Ramakrishna had many different realizations of the personal God in different forms. In the form of Krishna, Rama, Sita, Hanuman, within the Hindu tradition. But he also realized Christ during his practice of Christianity. He also realized Allah. Allah is formless but personal. This is another kind of complication. Muslims believe in the formless but the personal God. So God without form, but he's nonetheless personal in the sense that I just mentioned. Okay? So he had all of these different kinds of spiritual experiences. And it was on the basis of his different spiritual practices and his many different spiritual experiences that he affirmed the harmony of all religions. And he gave many different teachings to explain the harmony of religions. But one of his most famous is as many fades, so many paths. The original Bangla is either mot pot or joto mot toto pot. That's the most famous. If you go to Kolkata, any follower of Sri Ramakrishna will say, yes, he taught joto mot toto pot. As many fades, so many paths. But he has many other teachings. I'm going to mention a couple other teachings later in the presentation. Now, but then there's this question, as I mentioned, you might think it's a simple question to answer, but it's not. How exactly did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the world religions? And part of the point of my talk today is to militate against two common misconceptions about Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. What are these misconceptions? First misconception. Sri Ramakrishna held that all religions are true. He never said this. This is a serious mistake if people understand his view to be that all religions are true. He doesn't think that all religions are false either, but the converse is not true. And I don't think he ever says it. He doesn't say that all religions are true. And there's a deep philosophical reason why he doesn't say it. So there's some feedback going on, but now it's gone. That's good. Okay. So Frank Morales is one of the scholars who I think wrongly holds the view that Sri Ramakrishna held that all religions are true, and then he has an article where he claims this, and then he goes on to prove why this position is nonsensical. And therefore, we should discard Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions because it's bogus. It doesn't make any sense, it's incoherent. But my point is that he's attacking a straw man. In academia, straw man is if you attribute a position to another scholar or to a thinker that's not actually an accurate depiction of what that thinker believes. So I think that's what's happening here. He's claiming from the outset that Sri Ramakrishna held that all religions are true and then proceeds to debunk that claim. But that doesn't actually touch Sri Ramakrishna because he didn't hold that claim. I'll get into this in more detail a little bit later in the presentation. Second misconception about Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions is that he harmonized, yes?
Sorry, we're having a slave sound brew.
Okay.
Can I just,
Mm-hmm.
sorry.
No problem.
Oh, that's muted.
Oh, online they can't hear me at all?
Yeah, they can hear you on YouTube.
Oh, but not on Zoom.
Sorry. Oh, come on. There we go. Sorry.
Is it fine now? Hopefully? All right, to be pending. Okay. Second misconception, and this is very common. especially among followers of our tradition and some monks also. This is the view that Sri Ramakrishna harmonized the world religions on the basis of classical Advaita Vedanta, the classical philosophy of non-dualism taught by Shankara and his followers, according to which the common goal of all religious paths is the realization of non-dual, pure consciousness. So just to give you one example of a monk of our order who held this view, Swami Medhananda, he was a great monk of our order, and he wrote a number of articles in Bengali defending this interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. I think this is also a misconception, and I'm going to explain why. Contrary to the first misconception, number one, the view held by people like Frank Morales, Sri Ramakrishna held not that all religions are true, but that all religions are effective paths to the same goal of God realization, even if there are some mistakes in those religions. In spite of the mistakes in the different world religions, they can still be equally effective paths to the same goal of God realization. So I think that's what his view actually is. So that's why I think number one is wrong. What about two, this Advaitic interpretation, this non-dualistic interpretation of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine? Contrary to number two, Sri Ramakrishna never held that devotees of the personal God must attain Advaitic realization of non-dual pure consciousness. I just don't think it's a case that Sri Ramakrishna ever said that people who worship Christ or worship Allah or worship Krishna or worship Kali, like Sri Ramakrishna himself, have to ultimately go beyond all names and forms of God and realize your true identity, your true essence as non-dual pure consciousness. I don't think he ever said that. In fact, he said the opposite, as we'll see a little bit later in the presentation. So, I want to make a case that both of these interpretations of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions are wrong. And let me explain why. First, so regarding the second misconception, remember I said classical Advaita Vedanta. Some people interpret Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions through the lens of Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta. You might ask, well, what is classical Advaita Vedanta? It's the following. It's captured in a simple formula. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmeva Naparaha. In Sanskrit, the translation is Brahman alone is real. And here Brahman means non-dual pure consciousness. So not the personal God, but non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness. Brahman alone is real. Non-dual pure consciousness alone is real. Jagat Mithya, the world is unreal. From the ultimate standpoint, none of this exists. And it never existed, but through ignorance we thought it existed. And it's just an illusion that I'm talking to you right now, in fact, according to classical Advaita Vedanta. And Jivo Brahmeva Naparaha, the individual self is none other than Brahman. It's not even true that you're all, different individuals sitting on different chairs with different individual souls. None of that's true. There's just one soul. It's a super soul. That is pure consciousness, and nothing else exists from the ultimate standpoint. So that's classical Advaita Vedanta. So, to put it in the form of 5 doctrines, number 1, the soul reality is Brahman, which is non-dual pure consciousness. Okay? Which means, 2, the world, the personal God, in Sanskrit the term is Ishvara, and individual souls, jivas, are all empirically real, but ultimately non-existent. So classical Advaita Vedanta distinguish 2 tiers of reality, the empirical level and the absolute level. And what classical Advaitans say is, from the empirical standpoint, everything, we accept everything, the reality of this world, everybody here, yes, everything is real. God, the personal God who responds to our prayers, who's omniscient, omnipotent, the creator of this world, also real. You guys as individual souls, also real. But there's always a caveat with classical Advaita Vedanta. What does it mean to be empirically real but not absolutely real? What it means is the empirical standpoint is the standpoint of ignorance. So long as we remain ignorant of our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, we mistakenly think that all of this is real. But the moment we attain knowledge of Brahman, then all of this vanishes and we realize that it never existed. It's called Ajatavada, which means the doctrine of non-origination. This world never actually existed, but through ignorance we think it exists. Third doctrine of classical Advaita Vedanta. we attain liberation, the Sanskrit term is moksha, by attaining knowledge of our true nature as non-dual, pure consciousness. Fourth doctrine, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, is the only direct path to liberation. What is the path of knowledge? A qualified guru tells you your true nature, which is pure consciousness, based on Upanishadic teachings like Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that Brahman. You reflect deeply on that teaching, you meditate on that teaching, you try to assimilate that teaching into your daily life, and ultimately it should culminate in realization, direct knowledge of your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Fifth doctrine, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion for the personal God, and Karma Yoga, the yoga of unselfish action, only lead indirectly to liberation by purifying and concentrating the mind, thereby making us eligible to practice the higher spiritual practice of knowledge, the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. So there's a clear hierarchy in spiritual practices here. They put Jnana Yoga on the top, and all other spiritual practices are preparatory. They can help you qualify yourself to then move on to the highest practice, which is the path of knowledge, and only then can you attain liberation. Now, how is this relevant to the harmony of religions? As follows. Now, Shankara himself never talked about non-Hindu religions, but what happened in the 20th century is that a number of Indian thinkers, like Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, T.M.P. Mahadevan, what they did is they basically adopted Shankara's classical Advaitic metaphysics and then applied it to all of the world religions, used it as a rubric, as a framework for explaining how all the different world religions can be paths to the same goal. What did their classical Advaitic harmonization of all religions look like? This is my attempt at a diagram. It took me a long time to do this. Christians, through the practice of Christianity, realize the Christian God, whether that's God the Father or God as Jesus, right? But in either case. So classical Advaitins will admit this. They'll concede that. Yes, fine. Through the practice of Christianity, you can realize the Christian God. Muslims, through the practice of Islam, reading the Quran, following the practice of the Quran and the teachings of the Quran, will realize God is Allah. Theistic Hindus will also realize various forms of the personal God, whether that's Rama or Krishna or Kali or Shiva, and there are many other, I can multiply examples. Jews, by practicing Judaism, will realize God as God the Father, and so on and so forth. But what's the catch? Notice that they never reach the top of the mountain, or at least not yet. What do they have to do to reach the top of the mountain? And what is the top of the mountain? So, classical Advaita Vedantins will say that this is good, this is all good. You've made progress toward the peak, but you haven't yet reached the peak because you've realized various forms of the personal God, called Saguna Brahman in Sanskrit. But this is not sufficient for liberation. Liberation from what? Liberation from transmigratory existence, which means the cycle of rebirth. We have to come back to this world again and again, assuming new physical bodies. And after a certain point, after a certain number of embodiments, you get fed up with that. And that's the whole point. Then that's when spiritual life begins. I don't want to come back again. That's the feeling that you get. So tough luck, but none of these people are at the level of liberation yet. What do they have to do? Well, Christians have to, for instance, leave off the practice of Christianity, practice the path of knowledge, and only then will they realize the highest, ultimate liberation, which is realization of impersonal, non-dual Brahman, pure consciousness, the ultimate reality, which alone constitutes liberation. Same goes for the Muslims, same goes for Jews, same goes for whoever else believes in the personal God. All the theistic Hindus. Through the practice of your respective theistic religions, you can never attain the highest goal of life, which is liberation. This seems to be the classical Advaitic way of understanding the harmony of religions. That's why I think that it's deeply wrong-headed to read this view into Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on the harmony of religions, because I don't think he ever held such a hierarchical view. But let me go on to make a case for that. First, to help us in this endeavor of trying to understand more deeply and accurately what Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions actually was, I think it helps to bring in a very, very famous typology introduced by the Christian American theologian Alan Race in 1983 in his book Christians and Religious Pluralism. He gave three very, very influential terms for understanding how the different world religions relate to one another. First, exclusivism. Exclusivism is the view that only one religion leads to salvation, while all other religions do not lead to salvation. Tough luck for anybody else, but only my religion leads to the highest goal of salvation. One example of an exclusivist was Karl Barth. Is there an issue? Yeah, please. Okay, so back to exclusivism. The view that only my religion leads to salvation, other religions, tough luck, they don't lead to salvation. The Protestant Christian theologian Karl Barth held this view, and there are many others. I mean, we can multiply examples. The second paradigm for understanding the relationship among the world religions is called inclusivism. This is the view that only my religion leads directly to salvation, or the most quickly to salvation. But other religions are not completely hopeless. They lead indirectly to salvation, or they afford lesser forms of salvation. Does this ring a bell? I hope it does, except the arrows are not working again. Hold on a second. Oh, I see. Maybe I can do... Okay. Remember the mountain. So theistic religions only lead part of the way. Maybe 75% up the way, but not the whole way, right? So Advaita Vedanta is actually a good example of an inclusivist paradigm for harmonizing the world religions, because it puts non-dual pure consciousness and the path of knowledge at the peak. It's only through one spiritual practice, the path of knowledge, that you reach the highest goal. Other religions aren't wrong. They can lead us part of the way, but ultimately you have to stop your theistic practices, your devotional practices, practice the path of knowledge, and then you realize non-dual pure consciousness, and that's the goal, which is liberation from rebirth. And on the Christian side, Karl Rahner was a Catholic theologian, a German Catholic theologian who held a Catholic inclusivist position. He came up with a very famous phrase. Some of you might be aware of it. He referred to Hindus, for instance, and non-Christians as anonymous Christians. It's a very interesting concept. The idea that poor Hindus and Jews, we're practicing Christianity without knowing it. But through the grace of Christ, which is universal, even Christians are not beyond the pale. I mean, even non-Christians can be saved, just unconsciously. And so it's always better to practice things consciously. So it's still better to be a Catholic, because then you know that you're on the right path. Okay, so those are examples. From the Christian side, this idea of anonymous Christians in non-Christian traditions, and on the Advaita Vedantic side, that's also a kind of inclusivist paradigm, because it puts theistic religions on a lower footing than the path of knowledge. And there's a kind of higher-lower sort of hierarchy at play in all inclusivist paradigms. Finally, the third paradigm, religious pluralism. This is the view that multiple religions, more than one religion, multiple religions are equally capable of leading to the highest goal of salvation. So no higher and lower here, but Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Sufism, that's also part of Islam, Hinduism, and Advaita Vedanta, all of these paths are equally capable of leading us to salvation. And of course, I've left out examples of other religions. So let's keep in mind these three terms, especially, for these three different ways of understanding how the different world religions can relate to each other as we move forward and think about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on the harmony of religions. Which paradigm does he fall under? My argument is that he falls under the third paradigm, not the second paradigm. He was not an inclusivist. He was a full-blown religious pluralist who held that all the world religions are equally capable of leading to the same goal of salvation. And on the Christian side, there are a number of prominent Christian thinkers. Paul Knitter is still living. John Hick passed away a few years ago. These are examples of Christian religious pluralists. So you do find examples of religious pluralists in non-Hindu traditions as well. Now, let's begin on Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna, I believe, if you study the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna carefully, especially in the original Bengali language, the Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, that's the most authoritative and comprehensive record of his teachings. What you'll find is that he teaches this spiritual experience of Vijnana in many, many places. And I think that his teachings on Vijnana hold the key to understanding his doctrine of the harmony of religions and exactly how it's a pluralistic paradigm rather than a merely inclusivistic paradigm. So let's read his teaching. He says, the Jnani, the knower of Brahman, the knower of non-dual pure consciousness, so the follower of Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta, gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti, only then can that person realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. So the Vijnani goes one step further than the Jnani. The Vijnani realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all of its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality, the divine reality which is impersonal, nirguna, is also personal, saguna. This is known as Vijnana. So while the Jnani, well, let me explain in the next slide. The Jnani is the traditional classical Advaita Vedantin, the follower of Shankara, who attains spiritual realization of the impersonal, non-dual Brahman, pure consciousness, through the practice of the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. That corresponds, in this metaphor, to reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. What do leaving the steps behind signify? Saying that Brahman is not this world, it's not any of these names and forms, it's not my body, it's not my mind, until you realize that you are none other than that non-dual pure consciousness. The Vijnani goes one step further. He or she first attains the roof. She reaches the roof. After that, she realizes that Brahman is not only non-dual pure consciousness, but also the personal God. Saguna Brahman. So Shakti is also real. And the Vijnani also realizes, so there's another key difference. While the Jnani dismisses this world as a framework of illusion, this is Sri Ramakrishna's own language, as a framework of illusion, the Bangla is dhokartati. The Vijnani embraces this world as a mansion of mirth, or as a mart of joy. It can be translated in different ways. Majar kuti is the original Bengali phrase of Sri Ramakrishna. What does it mean? It's a real manifestation of God. Everything in this world is real, so long as we see God in everybody. But once we see God in the world, then we see that everything is a joyful, blissful manifestation of God. Okay, so now, in my scholarly work, I characterize Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy as Vijnana Vedanta, because I think that it's a philosophy, it's a Vedantic philosophy, but one based on this very unique and expansive, this very special spiritual experience called Vijnana. And I'm just going to mention three of the main doctrines of his philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta here, the ones that are relevant for understanding his views on the harmony of religions. First doctrine. According to Sri Ramakrishna, the sole reality is the infinite divine reality, call it God or whatever you want, which is the impersonal, non-dual Brahman in one aspect, so non-dual pure consciousness in one aspect, and the personal God, Shakti, in another aspect. The way he would put this is Brahma or Shakti Abhed. Brahman, by which he meant non-dual pure consciousness, the impersonal Brahman, and Shakti, the personal God, are Abheda. In Bangla, Abhed, it comes from the Sanskrit word Abheda, which means inseparable. They're inseparable but equally real aspects, the static and dynamic aspects, respectively, of the same infinite divine reality. So this first doctrine should make clear that this is also Advaita. It's a non-dual philosophy because there's only one reality. That reality is God. That's what I'm calling the infinite divine reality. But it's a life-affirming and world-affirming Advaita Vedanta. Why? Because two, the world and all individual souls are real manifestations of Shakti, the personal God. Everything in this world is actually a real manifestation of God. That's a stark contrast with classical Advaita Vedanta, which holds that from the ultimate standpoint, this world doesn't even exist. Third doctrine of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. All four of the main yogas, spiritual practices, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion toward a personal God, Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action, and Raja Yoga, the yoga of concentration and of meditation, are all direct paths to the same goal of God realization. Each of these yogas can take us to the highest goal. It's not that one particular yoga or multiple yogas are higher than the others. There's no hierarchy of yogas in Vijnana Vedanta. These are the three main doctrines that I wanted to emphasize. if you remember that in my slide on classical Advaita, I put it in the form of a formula. It was not my formula. It's a famous formula. Brahma satyam jagat mithya jivo brahmaiva naparaha. In the same way, I've come up with a formula to capture the essence of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, Vijnana Vedanta. The formula is, in Sanskrit, Brahma shakti satyam jagat satyam. The ultimate reality is not just non-dual pure consciousness, that's Brahman, but it's also Shakti. It's also the personal God. So that's why I say Brahma Shakti is Satyam, is true. So Brahma Shakti is Satyam, is true. And this world is real. But how is it real? It's real. The world is real as a manifestation of Shakti, as a manifestation of God. If you see this world without God, then it really is just it's just a mental imagination. But if you see God in the chair, in human beings, in the laptop, in the podium, then you see that all these different names and forms are real manifestations of divine consciousness. Okay, so keep this in the background, these three key doctrines of Vijnana Vedanta, because I think it's extremely important as a foundation. So it's his philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta which serves as the philosophical foundation, the theological foundation for his doctrine of the harmony of all religions. Where does he make this clear? In one of my favorite teachings, he says, God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. The reason why I like this teaching is because in the first phrase, he's explaining why there are infinite paths to God. There are infinite paths to God because God is infinite. Because God is infinite, there are correspondingly infinite paths to God. What does it mean that God is infinite? It means that you can never put a limit to God. This is another one of Sri Ramakrishna's common teachings. Bhagavana kono iti nai. You can never say God is just this and no more. God is just Krishna, or God is just Christ, or God is just non-dual pure consciousness, or God is just this or just that. These games have been going on for centuries. And that's the reason for so much fighting, violence, killing in the name of religion. Sri Ramakrishna says, no. Never try to put a limit to God because God is illimitable. God is infinite. And because God is illimitable and infinite, there are also correspondingly infinite paths to God. That's the beauty of this. Now, let's go a little bit more deeply. Devotees of the personal God, according to Sri Ramakrishna, these are called bhaktas in Bengali and Sanskrit, through their respective theistic paths, whether it's Christianity or Islam or theistic Hinduism or anything, or Judaism, they realize some form or aspect of the personal dimension of the impersonal, personal, infinite divine reality. Because the infinite divine reality is in one aspect personal and another aspect impersonal. Theistic religious practitioners, anybody who believes in the personal God, will realize some real aspect, some real dimension of the infinite divine, the personal dimension, right? And Advaita Vedantins, through the practice of the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, attain the non-dual realization of Brahman, which is the impersonal aspect of the same infinite divine reality. So because Sri Ramakrishna has a very expansive understanding of the ultimate reality as both impersonal and personal, and as illimitable, you can never put a limit to God. It's not just Christ, but also Allah, and also Krishna, and also all the different forms of the personal God. All of the theistic religious practitioners can realize their preferred form of the personal God, and Advaita Vedantins can realize non-dual pure consciousness, and they're all placed on an equal footing. Sri Ramakrishna illustrates his doctrine of the harmony of religions on the basis of his spiritual experience of Vijnana through a beautiful parable, the parable of a chameleon. So let's read it. He says, once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal. But why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. On being asked, he replied, yes, I live under this tree, and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon. And sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color, and now it has none. In like manner, one who this is Sri Ramakrishna, explaining the moral of this parable. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that God reveals himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal. Only the person who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. So I think this is a very philosophically deep parable. There's a lot we can pull out of it. I want to emphasize especially 4 key features. First, the different colors of the chameleon correspond to different forms of the personal God. The yellow chameleon might be Christ, the orange chameleon, Krishna, the red chameleon, Shiva, and so on and so forth. But what about the colorless chameleon? The second feature, the colorless chameleon corresponds to impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. This is the goal of classical Advaita Vedantans, arguably some Buddhists also. Third feature of this parable. This is very important. Does it make sense to say that the chameleon without any color is somehow truer or more real than the chameleon who at the time when it's yellow or red? No, they're all equally true, because that's the nature of a chameleon. You don't say the colorless chameleon is more real than the chameleon with colors. What does that mean philosophically? It means that the devotee of the personal God, that person's realization of the personal God, has the same status as the follower of the path of knowledge, their realization of non-dual pure consciousness. They're placed on an equal footing. People who love to worship the personal God and people who like to think of their true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. It's not that one is higher or better or more advanced spiritually than the other. They're placed on an equal footing. Fourth key lesson from this parable. Who's this funny person sitting under the tree? He or she is not an activist, but the person who sees the chameleon in many different colors. Sometimes it's colorless, sometimes it's red, sometimes it's blue. Who is that person? The person who has a more expansive knowledge of God. The person who has not just realized God as Christ, or just as Allah, or just as Krishna, or just as non-dual pure consciousness, but both and. The Vijnani, so it's the Vijnani. The person sitting under the tree is the Vijnani who realizes God as Christ, but also God as Allah, but also God as Krishna, and also God as his or her own true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. That's the idea. So it's the Vijnani who can tell others, wait a minute, you're all right, because I've realized God in multiple forms and aspects, but never limit God to what you have understood or realized of God. That's the catch. So, to bring in the classic mountain again, what does a mountain look on Sri Ramakrishna's pluralist harmonization of the world religions, as opposed to the classical Advaitic inclusivist harmonization that we already saw? I think that his view is as follows. Christians, through the path of Christianity, directly reach the peak of the mountain, which amounts to what? What is the peak? The realization of some aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, which leads directly to salvation. Same goes for Muslims, for instance. Same goes for Jews. Same goes for Hindus, theistic Hindus. Same goes for Advaita Vedantans, who believe in non-dual pure consciousness as the highest reality. Same goes for Buddhists, for instance. Every single religious practitioner is in an equally advantageous position to attaining the highest goal of salvation through their respective religious paths. Okay? Another key aspect of his doctrine of the harmony of religions, which is not often talked about, but which I think is crucial, is the following. It's his expansive conception of final salvation. What does it look like? Oh, imagine that I've attained the highest goal of life while in the body. What happens when I leave this physical body? Where do I go? Do I go anywhere at all? What does heaven look like? Is it heaven? According to Sri Ramakrishna, there are 2 fundamentally different types of spiritual aspirants. What he calls bhaktas, meaning people who are devotionally oriented, people who just feel inclined to worship the personal God in some form, who strive to cultivate a loving relationship with the personal God. So that means they have to maintain some distance between God. You can't have a relationship with somebody unless you're different from that person, right? That's what relationship implies or entails. And another type of person is a jnani. Intellectually oriented people like Advaita Vedantins and Buddhists, who strive for nirvana. And nirvana here just means it's a salvific state in which no sense of individuality remains. They say, good riddance to individuality. I don't want to be me. I don't want to be me. That's just a fundamentally different temperament. And the beauty of Sri Ramakrishna is that he accepts both equally. In contrast to all the traditional schools of Vedanta, I'm not going to go into all the different traditional schools, I discussed that in other lectures, Sri Ramakrishna grants equal value to both the Advaitic and the devotional ideals of salvation. Okay? And what he says is that the form of salvation we choose depends on our individual temperament and our preference. The way he would put it is, bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, they don't want to become sugar. They want to eat sugar. Becoming sugar is the paradigm of classical Advaita Vedanta and even some Buddhists. I don't want to be an individual anymore. I want to be pure consciousness. I want to be sugar. Bhaktas, they say, I don't want to be sugar. That's no fun. I want to taste sugar. What is the sugar here? The personal God. What does that mean? Bhaktas want to remain in a heaven, in a loving relationship with the personal God in some form. So this is the last bullet point. While some spiritual aspirants seek to merge their individuality in the impersonal, non-dual Brahman, devotees of the personal God tend to prefer to retain a sense of individuality, some distance and some sense of individuality, in order to enjoy the bliss of loving communion with the personal God. Okay? So two fundamentally different pictures of what final salvation looks like. Now, how do I know, or how do we know, that Sri Ramakrishna actually held this view? This is a dialogue that's recorded in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Mohima was a householder devotee of Sri Ramakrishna who was a staunch classical Advaita Vedantin. He loved Shankara's philosophy. And so he asks a very interesting question. He says, I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? Bhakta means, remember, the worshipper of the personal God, the theistic religious practitioner, and needs nirvana. Nirvana not in the narrowly Buddhistic sense, but nirvana in the sense of, doesn't the devotee of the personal God ultimately have to get rid of his or her individuality at the highest level, right, to attain the highest salvation? Because the highest salvation doesn't seem to allow for any trace of individuality to remain. That seemed to be Mahima's classical Advaitic standpoint. What is Sri Ramakrishna's response? Sri Ramakrishna says, it cannot be said that bhaktas need nirvana. They don't need to dissolve their individuality in Brahman. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna is with his eternal bhaktas. Nitto Krishna ta nitto bhakto. Krishna is spirit or consciousness embodied, and his abode also is consciousness embodied. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. Krishna is eternal and the bhaktas also are eternal. Nitto Krishna, nitto bhakta. That means for devotees of the personal God, they don't at some point have to be told, sorry, I know you love your Krishna, or Christians, I know you love your Christ, but at this point, you can't go further with Christ. You're going to have to, and you're going to have to lose your own individuality. No more loving Christ and no more individual self. You are Brahman from this point on. No, you don't have to do that. Nobody's going to be force-fed Advaita Vedanta. Another metaphor he uses to explain the same expansive conception of final salvation is this beautiful metaphor of an infinite ocean. He says, Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, is like an infinite ocean. Intense cold freezes the water into ice, which floats on the ocean in blocks of various forms. Likewise, through the cooling influence of bhakti, devotion toward the personal God, one sees forms of God in the ocean of the Absolute. These forms are meant for the bhaktas, the lovers of God. But when the sun of knowledge rises, the ice melts. It becomes the same water it was before, water above and water below, everywhere nothing but water. Now let's pause here for a second. If the parable stopped here, if the metaphor stopped here, classical Advaita Vedantins would feel vindicated. They'll say, wonderful, but with the rising of the sun of knowledge, all of these forms of the personal God melt away, which means that we're the highest standpoint, inclusivism. We're at the peak of the mountain, and theistic religions can take us part of the way, but unfortunately not all the way. But the story doesn't end there. Sri Ramakrishna adds, but you may say that for certain devotees, God assumes eternal forms. Nitto Shakar is the original Bengali. There are places in the ocean where the ice does not melt at all. It assumes the form of quartz. This is what throws a wrench into any attempt to explain Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on the harmony of religions from a classical Advaitic standpoint, from an inclusivist standpoint. Yeah, it's all true. He believed that all the different religions are different paths to the same goal. What's that goal? The realization of non-dual pure consciousness, of course. No, that's not what he said. He says that bhaktas who love Christ or Krishna or Allah, they don't have to give up their Christ or Krishna or Allah. That for them, that eternally remaining in loving communion with their cherished form of the personal God is salvation for them. Eating sugar, right? Since Sri Ramakrishna conceives this divine reality expansively as both the impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness, that's what Sri Ramakrishna would call Brahman, and as the personal God, that's what Sri Ramakrishna called Shakti, his conception of the salvific goal of all religions is equally expansive. For non-theistic spiritual aspirants like Advaita Vedantins and some Buddhists, so followers of the path of knowledge, salvation consists in the complete dissolution of one's individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. Sri Ramakrishna would use the example of a salt doll, which went to measure the depth of the ocean. But the moment it set foot in the ocean, what happened to the salt doll? It melted in the ocean. That's the ideal of classical Advaita Vedantins and some Buddhists who want nirvana. By contrast, for spiritual aspirants in theistic religious traditions, like Vaishnavism in Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, salvation takes the form of eternal loving communion with the personal God in a transcendental realm, in some form of heaven, which is eternal. Since there are various lokas, this is the Sanskrit term loka, for basically these kind of transcendental heavens, there are also multiple theistic forms of salvation. For instance, while devotees of Krishna can dwell eternally with their beloved Krishna in Vaikuntha Loka, actually I think it would be Goloka, that's the technical term for this heaven that they believe in. Christians can dwell with Christ or God the Father in their Christian heaven. Muslims can commune with Allah in their eternal paradise called Jannah in Arabic, and so on and so forth. They're all true. It's not that there's one heaven that everybody has to go get into. There can be different heavens. We're in one room, I'm talking to you now in one room, but maybe somebody else is in another room in the same convent cooking food or something like that. Why can't that be true about salvation? I like to think of salvation from Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint as a many-roomed mansion. And so there's a Christian room, there's also a Muslim room, and there's also an Advaita Vedantic room. Why not? And you choose the room you want. In short, Sri Ramakrishna was not only a religious pluralist who held that different religious paths are equally capable of leading to salvation, but he was also what I would call a salvific pluralist, in that he held that salvation itself takes a variety of forms depending on the temperament and preferences of the respective souls. Now, we get to a thorny problem. This is the problem raised by many philosophers and theologians. When it comes to any time you defend a religious pluralist position, we accept Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, they're all on an equal footing. One question comes up again and again. It's what's called the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. Wait a minute, you say that different religions can take us to the highest goal equally, but different religions claim radically different things. If different religions make conflicting claims about historical and metaphysical realities, how can all religions be valid? So let's be more concrete. Let me give you a couple examples. Did Christ die on the cross? Christians will obviously say, of course he did. That's the whole basis of our religion. But what about Muslims? They deny that. They say that Christ didn't die on the cross. So if Sri Ramakrishna, again and again in the gospel, he says, through the path of Christianity you can realize God, through the path of Islam you can also realize God. But wait a minute, they contradict each other. These religions contradict each other on many issues, but this is one of them. Muslims say Christ didn't die on the cross. Christians say Christ did die on the cross. So what is Sri Ramakrishna saying? Is he committing himself to the contradiction that that Christ did die on the cross and that he didn't die on the cross by affirming the equal validity of Christianity and Islam? No. Another example, before I explain why my answer is no. Is rebirth true? Orthodox Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they all say no. We're not reborn. This is it. Good luck. You better get salvation in this life. But what about Hinduism and Buddhism? They say yes, no. If we don't succeed this time, we'll have to come back in another body and we'll try, we'll take off from where we left off in our last birth. Again, there's a direct conflict at the level of doctrine between different world religions. So, does Sri Ramakrishna commit the contradiction of saying that rebirth is true by accepting Hinduism and Buddhism, and that rebirth is not true by also accepting Orthodox Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? There's another example. No. Crucially, Sri Ramakrishna did not claim that all religions are true. This should go back to the first slide, that first misconception perpetrated by people like Frank Morales. If we believe that his view is that all religions are true, you end up in these massive, I think, inseparable logical contradictions. But he never claimed that. He claimed that all religions are salvifically efficacious. That's a fancy technical term for what? It just means that all religions, in spite of its errors, are equally capable of taking us to the goal of salvation, which is God realization in some form or aspect. Let's go into it in a little bit more detail. And to do that, it helps to bring in, remember I mentioned the name of a Christian religious pluralist? His name was John Hick. He was one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, in my opinion. He classified three types of, in order to, because he was a religious pluralist, he had to answer the same problem. He had to solve this problem. So he said, okay, to help us answer this problem, let's distinguish three types of conflicting religious truth claims. First type, disagreements about past historical events that are in principle accessible to human observation. An example of this, did Christ die on the cross? If we were there at 0 CE, at that exact place where the cross was there, we could just say, yeah, Christ died on the cross, or not. That's the first kind of conflicting truth claim. Second type, disagreements about what Hick calls trans-historical matters, which cannot be verified by historical or other empirical evidence. What's an example? Did God incarnate as Christ? Did God incarnate as Krishna? What empirical evidence could we possibly give to prove that? I don't think there is any. That's an example of the second kind of conflicting religious truth claim. Third type, disagreements about what Hick calls ultimate questions, like the nature of ultimate reality. Is God personal or impersonal is a good example of that. And if God is personal, well, what form of the personal God? Christ or Allah, or maybe both. Okay? So let's keep this in mind. So now, I think that Sri Ramakrishna adopts one particular position on the first two types of conflicting religious truth claims, and he adopts a different position on the third type. So first, the first two types. Sri Ramakrishna's stance on conflicting historical and trans-historical religious truth claims. What does he say? He says these are not soteriologically vital. Again, fancy term, all it means is, even if the doctrines of a particular religion are wrong about these issues, that doesn't handicap that religion from the standpoint of salvation. He says the following, that yearning, Byakulata in Bangla, Vyakulata is the whole thing. That yearning for God is the whole thing. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahmo. Brahmo are followers of the Brahmo Samaj, which is very popular in the 19th century. The vital point is yearning. God is our inner guide, Antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path, only you must be restless for him. God himself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks his watch is right. But as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right. But that doesn't hamper one's work. So this watch analogy, I think, really helps us understand in a much deeper way in what sense all the different religions can be equally valid paths to the goal of salvation. No religion is 100% true. No religion, including his own, which was Hinduism. No. Every religion has some mistakes. But what he says is, in spite of those mistakes, that the religion can still be in a position to take you to salvation. On these relatively minor, I don't want to say minor issues, but on these two issues, historical issues and trans-historical issues. Now, what does he say about the third type? What is the third type, in case you guys have forgotten? Disagreements about ultimate questions, like the nature of ultimate reality. He takes a bit of a different stance here. What he says is that from his standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta, religious truth claims about the ultimate reality are complementary rather than conflicting. They may seem to be conflicting, but if you have a sufficiently broad standpoint, what you'll find is that they're actually complementary. And he gives another beautiful parable, which is not unique to him. He's not the one to have come up with this parable, the blind man and the elephant. Many of you are familiar with this. Some people think that this started as a Jaina metaphor, the Jain tradition. Some people say it's Buddhist, but I think it's probably a Jaina metaphor. What does he say? Imagine that there's a giant elephant and there are 5 blind people, each touching a different part of the elephant. So the person touching the tails is saying, hey guys, I know what this elephant is like, it's furry. Another person who's touching the trunk says, you're an idiot, it's not furry, it's scaly, it's dry. Another one touches the toenail and says, no, it's cold to the touch and very hard. And they argue with each other. Who's the person who can adjudicate that argument? The person with vision who can see the whole elephant. And that person comes and says, wait a minute, you're all right and you're all wrong. You're all right because you're all really touching different parts of the elephant, but you're all wrong in limiting the elephant to that small part of the elephant that you're touching. In the same way, all the different world religious practitioners are right in saying that, Islam says that God is Allah. Christianity says God is God the Father and God the Christ. Vaishnavas say God is Krishna, and so on and so forth. But the moment you limit God to what you understand or have realized of God, you're putting a limit to God, and that's the mistake, which you should never make. And the Vijnani, who's realized multiple forms and aspects of God, that person is in a unique position to tell us that, wait a minute, all of your different conceptions of God, even though they might seem to be conflicting, are actually complementary. Okay? And just to sum up, I think that there are 4 key advantages of Sri Ramakrishna's, what I'm calling his Vijnana-based doctrine of the harmony of religions, which is a full-blown religious pluralism. Okay? In what sense? Number 1, the major world religions are equally effective paths to realizing some aspect or form of one and the same impersonal, personal, infinite reality. So there's no higher and lower here. It's not an inclusivist paradigm, it's a pluralist paradigm, because all the different major world religions are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal. Second major advantage, since the personal God and the impersonal absolute are different but equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality, theistic and non-theistic religions are placed on an equal ontological footing. What are theistic religions? Religions that believe in a personal God, in the sense that I explained earlier. Non-theistic religions, Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, and maybe some others also. They're put on an equal footing, no higher and lower. Advaita is not at the top. Third key advantage, he has a very expansive view of salvation. Instead of imposing a narrow salvific goal, so you can call it, scholars call it a monolithic view of salvation, which means salvation is one. Everybody has to attain the same form of salvation. Sri Ramakrishna didn't believe that. He taught that a theist can dwell in an eternal heaven with the personal God form, whether that's Christ or Krishna or Shiva or whatever, while an Advaita Vedantin can merge his or her individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. Again, remember the many-roomed mansion. They can just inhabit different rooms of the same mansion of salvation. Fourth big advantage, Sri Ramakrishna's broad conception of God, of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality, provides what I call an ontological rationale for active interreligious dialogue. I've been going to a lot of interfaith meetings since coming to Hollywood. I was living in India for 13 years, but I came back in August. And one of the things that I'd like to see more of, I feel like there's not enough of that in these interfaith groups, but where we actually get into the kind of theological nitty-gritty and philosophical nitty-gritty of, okay, it's good, we're all respectful toward each other, but what can we learn from each other? What can the Muslim learn from the Christian? What can the Hindu learn from the Muslim? And often the conversations don't go that far, which I find unfortunate. But Sri Ramakrishna helps us understand how. Remember the blind man and the elephant. If I'm a Hindu and I learn from a sincere Christian about the teachings of Christ, about the Bible, if I approach a sincere Muslim and I learn about the Quran and the sublime teachings of the Quran, and I look at that person's life and see what a humble and spiritual life that person is leading, what do I learn? I can learn, number one, I gain insight into other aspects and forms of the same infinite divine. Because remember, Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions is based on this idea of God as infinite. So the more we expose ourselves to religions other than our own, the more we learn about this infinite God. Oh, I see, God is also Christ. What a wonderful thing that God incarnated as Christ. Oh, I see, God is also Allah. He's the formless but personal God. Oh, I see, God is also Krishna. And oh, God is also non-dual pure consciousness. The more religions you expose yourselves to, the more you learn about God, him or herself. I mean, God is both he and she, right, in Sri Ramakrishna's conception. Okay, so this is my final slide. So if you're interested in a more rigorous discussion of these issues, please look at chapters 3 and 4 of my book, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press, called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, published under my pre-sannyasa name, Ayan Maharaj. Maharaj is a monastic title. Okay, thanks. And so now, announcements, I believe, right? So, okay, first of all, I've been told that I'll be greeting you guys outside, right outside the temple, number one. Number two, I would love to hear from you because I've been yapping away for a while now. So after greeting you, I ask that those of you who have questions to please come back, and we'll have a Q&A, which will also be recorded for the benefit of the online audience. And let me make the following announcements. Saturday, January 14th, Swami Vivekananda's birthday. Big celebration from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. There will be a reading from the Katha Upanishad with breakfast. 11 a.m. puja, worship. 12:45 p.m. Homa fire. And then prasad lunch in the convent. The next day, Sunday, January 15th, Swami Vedarupanandaji will be giving a lecture on the non-dual reality. That's the title of his lecture. And on Wednesday, January 18th, it will be the birthday of Swami Subodhanandaji, a monastic disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, and Pravrajika Krishna Prana will be speaking on that day. Thank you. I look forward to meeting all of you outside, and hopefully for the Q&A afterward. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.
Lead us from illusion to truth and wisdom's sight. Lead us from the darkness that fears of the night. Lead us from death to endless life, to your heart of love, to your eternal light. Reach us through every veil that seems to hide your face, beyond our every ignorance, beyond both time and space. Give us strength and courage through thy blessed grace, and fill our hearts with your love by your sweet, compassionate face. Om Tat Sat Om, Om Tat Sat Om, Om Tat Sat Om, Om Tat Sat
All right, so why don't we begin the question and answer session? So, any questions about anything I said?
Where did you live in India for 13 years?
13 years. 11 of those years were spent in Belur Math on the outskirts of Kolkata, which is the global headquarters of our monastic order, the Ramakrishna order. There's a university there, which used to be called Vivekananda University, which now has a much more complicated name, abbreviated RKMVery. So I joined there. I was the first brahmachari to join, the first novitiate to join at this new university, which was founded in like 2005, and I joined in 2010. And so I was fortunate enough, by the grace of Sri Ramakrishna, to continue my academic work. And even though I did my PhD work on German philosophy, German aesthetics at Berkeley, and in Germany, I switched fields to Vedanta and global philosophy of religion, and I haven't looked back since. Yeah, and then in the last 1.5 years, I spent in Mysore, South India. There's a center there, and then I was asked to come to Hollywood. Yeah, other questions?
I'm trying to remember exactly the words that you used.
Hmm.
You put truth and, what was it, salvific efficacy?
Yeah, that's right.
And this was, can you remind me, what was the context in which you
The
had
context,
those?
well, I mean, one of the contexts was that this misconception about Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions is that he said that all religions are true. And my point is, if he held that view, he would end up in a bunch of logical contradictions, like saying that rebirth is true and that it's not true. Why? Because he accepts the truth of Christianity and Islam in their orthodox forms, which deny rebirth. He also accepts Buddhism and Hinduism, which affirm rebirth. And so I don't think that was his view, because he never said it. But secondly, there's a serious logical difficulty with accepting that view. So my view is that he claims that all religions are not necessarily true at the level of doctrine. And it's not that they're 100% true. There are errors in all religions, but those errors in a religion don't detract from that religion's salvific efficacy. Its ability to lead us to the highest goal of salvation. So that's the idea.
I think something else you had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation was in two kinds of truth, the empirical
and
truth,
ultimate. Yeah, absolutely.
and that it's sort of that difference between a salvific truth and an empirical truth would be, it seems to me, more like the correct way to use the word truth would be to refer to the salvific efficacy. Truth itself is that, I think.
I think some people say that we can't separate them fully. Right? Is that what you're getting at? That truth itself can't be fully separated from a religion's ability to lead to salvation? Or
yes, I think that I realize I say all the time, that's true. That religion is also true. That religion's also true. I use this word true to apply to these things.
Right.
And I'm realizing I am referring to that salvific efficacy.
I see. Oh, okay. That's a nice point. Is that actually in English, when some people say all religions are true, sometimes they mean they're not that all the doctrines in all religions are true, but that they're equally valid paths to the same goal of salvation. The problem is, in Wikipedia, there's this, if you type in Michael Jordan, there's obviously the basketball player, there's also, I think, like an R&B singer or something, and there are a bunch of other Michael Jordans. So there's this disambiguation page that comes up. And so if somebody says all religions are true, what we need to do is ask them for disambiguation. Well, in what sense true? Because as I said, Frank Morales is one guy who is very opposed to this idea of the harmony of religions. And so he attacks Sri Ramakrishna's views by caricaturing it as the view that all religions are true, not in the sense you're talking about, as being valid paths to the same goal of salvation, but as actually committing himself to the truth of all the doctrines of all the different world religions. So I think it's better to just for the sake of clarity and rigor, to avoid the word true if we don't actually mean truth by it. Yes. Call me crazy, but...
Thank you, Maharaj. It's great to hear from you. But my first question, I was in Dakshineshwar a couple of weeks ago and watching Mother. And today's lecture, you mentioned Shakti. Is the Mother there is the real representation of Shakti Sri Ramakrishna was trying to say, or Shakti in the sense of the Divine Mother, which is one form, Goddess Kali?
What was the first alternative? Again, I just didn't catch the question fully.
When I was looking at Mother in Dakshineshwar, and today's lecture, as you were saying, Shakti, before that you mentioned something with Advaita Vedanta and Shakti, if I'm right.
Yeah.
So that Shakti, everything manifestation of divine Shakti. So the Dakshineshwar Mother is one form of that divine Shakti, right?
Yeah, that's right. But Shakti takes so many forms. Shakti, by Shakti, he means in the broadest sense the personal God.
Okay.
Shakti in the form of Christ, Shakti in the form of Krishna, Shakti in the form of Kali. Shakti also has an impersonal aspect, which is non-dual pure consciousness. So the way he would put it is, when God is inactive, static, then I call it Brahman. When that same God is creating, preserving, and destroying the universe, then I call it Kali or Shakti. See, he's not limiting Shakti to just the Dakshineshwar Kali. Anytime you think of God as personal, that's Shakti. And that Shakti can manifest in infinite forms, as Christ and Allah and so many, right? Does that make sense?
Yes. My second question is, you mentioned today Shaguna and Nirguna. Would you kindly little enlighten me on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, Nirguna just means literally without attributes or without qualities. And so that's the highest reality according to classical Advaita Vedantins. Brahman is Nirguna in the sense of being completely free from all attributes, which means even the attributes, all the good attributes of the personal God. Brahman, it's not accurate to say that ultimately Brahman is omniscient. It's not accurate to say that Brahman is ultimately omnipotent. It's not accurate to say that Brahman responds to our prayers because he's all loving. None of that's true about the ultimate reality, according to classical Advaita Vedanta. So that's Nirguna. Saguna is the opposite. God has qualities. The ultimate reality has qualities. What qualities? Not qualities like jealousy and anger and those things. Qualities like what are called the omni attributes by philosophers and theologians. God is omniscient. God is all powerful. God is all loving, and so on and so forth. And so there have been fierce debates across the centuries within India, because there are many different philosophical schools, some of which are devotional and others of which are like classical Advaitans, classical Advaita Vedanta. And they've always been at loggerheads about this. No, you're wrong in saying that Brahman is personal. No, you're wrong in saying that Brahman is impersonal. And then interestingly, some schools of Vedanta, specifically Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta and Shuddha Advaita Vedanta of Vallabha, they claim, no, you guys are both right. Brahman is also true. So Nirguna Brahman is true, Saguna Brahman is also true. But Saguna Brahman is higher in some way than Nirguna Brahman. So some schools accept the reality of both the impersonal and the personal, but they put the personal on a higher footing than the impersonal. And so for instance, Achintya Bheda Veda, Chaitanya school, they say that yes, you guys, you followers of the path of knowledge, it's good, but you guys are reaching a much lesser form of salvation than we, worshippers of Krishna. All you realize is the tanubha, the peripheral brilliance of Krishna. And another school which has a similar view is called Vallabha Shuddhadvaita. Vallabha was the founder of the school, pure non-dualism. And what he uses the metaphor of a foot. He says, what you followers of the path of knowledge are realizing when you realize Brahman is just the foot of Krishna. We have the whole of Krishna. So there's still, even though these schools accept the reality of both the personal and the impersonal, they still have a hierarchy, putting the personal above the impersonal. Advaita Vedantins, at the end of the day, they don't even accept the reality of the personal God. They do only from the empirical standpoint. But remember what I said about what empirical means. It means standpoint of ignorance. So long as you're stupid and ignorant, so then you should believe in the personal God. But when you realize the truth, which is your true nature as non-dual pure conscious, you realize that there was no personal God. There were no chairs, no audience, no lecture, no world, and no personal God. So that's a little bit of an explanation of Nirguna and Saguna. And so what does Sri Ramakrishna do? He not only accepts the full reality of both Brahman, Nirguna Brahman on the one hand, and Shakti, Saguna Brahman on the other, but he refuses to bring in any kind of hierarchies of higher and lower in the way that some other traditional Vedantic schools do. He doesn't say that Shakti is higher than Brahman or that Brahman is higher than Shakti. He says they're inseparable, but equally real and equally valuable aspects of the same infinite divine reality. What metaphors does he use? He says, like fire and its power to burn. And then he adds, you cannot think of fire without thinking of fire's power to burn. Conversely, you cannot think of fire's power to burn without thinking of fire. So it has they mutually entail each other, Brahman and Shakti. Does that make sense?
So they're inclusive to each other.
Inclusive might not be the best word. They're inseparable from each other.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the moment you say include, it's like, well, is it like a bucket including water? No. But they're inseparable but equally real aspects of the same infinite reality.
So after the Dakshineshwar, I went to Puri. So I was questioning myself. So when you go to Puri inside Jagannath temple, Lord Krishna, right? So all the devotee there and the Dakshineshwar devotee, so that's the devotion of bhakti, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yoga. So one group is bhakti of Shakti, one group is devotion towards you mentioned today's who follow Krishna followers, those kind, but this all lead to Brahma ultimately, right?
It depends on how you define Brahman. That's part of the point of my talk, was that if you define Brahman narrowly as non-dual pure consciousness, I think that was not Sri Ramakrishna's view. He never said that bhaktas have to realize non-dual pure consciousness. They want to eat sugar, let them eat sugar. Why force them to become sugar? That seemed to be his standpoint. I want to mention one beautiful story about Jagannath Puri. Many of you may not know this because it's not found in the Gospel, it's not found in the Leela Prasanga, Sri Ramakrishna's Divine Play, the biography written by Sharadananda. It's found in M's recordings of M's conversation. M is the author of the Gospel, Mahendranath Gupta. And in one of those conversations he tells a story about visiting Jagannath Puri. He's in Dakshineshwar, talking to Sri Ramakrishna, and he says, "So, Thakur, I'm going to visit Jagannath and Puri soon." Sri Ramakrishna becomes very excited because he loves Jagannath Puri. In fact, he loved Jagannath Puri so much, not just loved him so much, he identified so deeply with Jagannath that he often said, if I ever visit, you might ask, well, if he loved it so much, then why did he never visit Puri? He said, if I ever visit Jagannath Puri, I'll leave my body. Because he's so deeply identified with Jagannath. So that's just a side note. So M tells him, I'm going to visit Jagannath Puri. And Sri Ramakrishna says, okay, then do me a favor. What you do is, you go into the inner sanctum. Like this is the inner sanctum, they have this inner sanctum, which most people, at that time maybe everybody was allowed, but you have to kind of wait longer and get special permission maybe. Go into the inner sanctum, embrace Jagannath for me. Come back to Dakshineshwar, and then tell me, and then I'll hug you, and then by the transitive property, I will have hugged Jagannath. So M says, oh boy, okay, all right. I mean, it's my guru, of course I have to obey him. So he goes on this pilgrimage to Puri. He goes into the inner sanctum. He sees Jagannath there in all his glory. He says, now Sri Ramakrishna wants me to embrace Jagannath. This is not normally done. And there are priests like watching your every step, and you make sure not to come too close to the deity, and this and that. So he's thinking, but he's a smart guy. He's like 3 master's degrees, and so he's like, okay, I've got some change in my pocket, spare change, coins. So what does he do? He takes out those coins furtively. And when he sees that nobody's watching him, he just tosses them on the floor. So the priests start chasing after the coins. And at that moment, he jumps up and embraces Jagannath and comes back down, as if nothing happened. And then he walks out. And then he comes back to Sri Ramakrishna and Dakshineshwar. And Sri Ramakrishna says, with a smile, he said, did you hug Jagannath for me? He said, yes. Then Sri Ramakrishna gives him a big hug. He says, now I have hugged Jagannath. It's a beautiful story. Yeah. So there are a lot of gems, hidden gems, which you don't find in the standard literature, but I strongly recommend it. It's called, in Bangla, it's Srimad Darshan. The whole thing has been translated, I believe, into English, but I'm not positive about that. But it's basically recordings of conversations between M and others who would, he inspired so many people to join the order, and he would only talk about Sri Ramakrishna. So full of devotion for Sri Ramakrishna. So you find all these hidden gems in these other texts. Any other questions? Yes.
Hello. I have a question. You made a distinction between people who want to eat sugar and the people who want to be sugar, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that people need to pick one path or the other to get onto the top of the mountain, even though they're both valid? Or can people kind of dabble in both, practitioners?
Yeah, so the dabbling, I don't think it's theoretically impossible, but practically it seems to be impossible. Sri Ramakrishna would often say, if you dig in one place for water, and then after 5 minutes you say, I'm bored. Let me go 5 feet away, because there will be more fun. And then you start digging there. He says you'll never actually hit water. So likewise, he would say, practice your faith, whatever path you're on, fully and sincerely to the utmost. Because if you are a spiritual dabbler all your life, you're never going to actually be able to dive deep. And so you're almost certainly not likely to attain salvation, which we're talking about in this context, right? So, but one thing he says is that M asks this question to Sri Ramakrishna in one place in the Gospel. He says, isn't it possible to have both jnana and bhakti? Sri Ramakrishna sort of like reprimands him. And he says, what you're talking about is an extremely high state of spiritual realization. If you're an incarnation like Chaitanya, yes. But ordinary souls, no. In general, no. There are exceptions, and by God's grace, anything is possible. But in general, it's one or the other. But also because temperamentally, most of us don't even want both. If you go deep enough, I mean, superficially at the level of ego and mind, we might want both. But when you go down to penetrate the level of the soul, what does a soul want? Swami Vivekananda used to say, no person is born into a religion. Each person has a religion in the depths of his or her soul. And the first step in spiritual life is penetrating that soul and figuring out what is that religion in the depth of my heart. And what you'll find is generally that the leaning is either toward the personal God or toward the impersonal. Some people may like both, and it's fine to practice both in a way, but you have to keep one as primary. That seems to me to be the key. Because otherwise it really does become a kind of spiritual dilettantism, and then you're not going to be able to dive deep in the spiritual practice. Thanks. Does that answer the question? Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, I think he also has... Okay, so after him, we'll go to you. That's okay.
This is very personal. Something happened in Dakshineshwar. So I was standing in front of mother, and I always grew up in a family where my parents were devotee of Ramakrishna. So I heard all the story how Ramakrishna made Goddess Kali. So I was looking at her. It was evening time, and there was prayer going on, and I've been Dakshineshwar many, many times. So this time, I was looking at mother, and mother eyes become live, and I think that was my chance given to me in my life. But only thing, I felt I could talk to mother, but I couldn't because there are so many people. And I regret today, I say I should have asked something in my mind to mother, because I could purely see mother was alive.
No, thank you for sharing. So you can go again next time. Maybe you can talk to her next time. Yeah, thank you. It's very good. Try to cherish those experiences in your heart. I think it's better not to share too much about your deepest experiences between you and God. Yeah, thank you.
Just for fun, sort of, it occurs to me that if there's different mansions for different religions,
Different rooms of the same
rooms in
mansion.
the same
Yeah,
mansion,
yeah.
right. So what happens when Mahakali dissolves everything at the end of evolution and whatever, and everything is absorbed back into Brahman?
Yeah, that doesn't apply to these eternal heavens, these transcendental lokas. Yeah, it's because no, I'm not even joking. I mean, this is all material. So this whole thing about coming into seed form at the end of creation, that has nothing to do with these transcendental higher realms. They're untouched by them, because that's the whole point of being transcendental. They're beyond this world, the realm of matter, basically. Does that make sense? Christian heaven, they're not included in this. These are worlds of gross matter.
They're not included in the dissolution of the universe?
Absolutely not.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything online? There was someone who
These heavens are non-physical, actually. They're not made of matter. That's what allows them to be eternal. That's why Sri Ramakrishna used the language Chinmoy Sham Chinmoy Dham. Krishna is eternal and suffused with divine consciousness, and his Dhamma, his eternal abode, is also suffused with divine consciousness. It's not physical matter.
Anything up there?
Oh,
Because there was someone who wanted to ask a question on YouTube. So
sure. Yeah, in Hollywood, I often get more online questions than in-person questions.
What are your views on different interpretations of scriptures?
Okay, this is not, I guess, directly related to the lecture, but I can answer it. What are my views? My views are the same as Swami Vivekananda's views. What did Swami Vivekananda say? He said that if you study the traditional commentaries on the Vedantic scriptures, like the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutta, you'll find all sorts of different and often conflicting interpretations. It can be overwhelming. It can be confusing. What does Vivekananda say? Swami Vivekananda says, don't blindly follow any of these traditional commentaries. Because if you do, you're going to end up with a narrow and sectarian and almost certainly misleading and possibly even false interpretation of the Vedantic scriptures. Because the scriptures themselves, when you read them apart from commentaries, they seem very broad. If you read the Upanishads, in the same breath, the Upanishads are talking about the personal God, Ishvara, and also as Brahman, in the sense of impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. And so what Swami Vivekananda says is, let's try to reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures not based on any one of the traditional commentators, whether it's Shankara or Ramanuja or Madhva and so on and so forth, but in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. And the next question is, well, isn't that just another kind of sectarian bias? Because then we're going to be reading everything through the lens of Sri Ramakrishna. Arguably, no. And again, I add arguably because that can be argued, and that's something we should discuss. That's got to be kind of a separate lecture. But the key here is, I think what Swami Vivekananda's idea is, if you study the Vedantic scriptures on their own, what you'll find is that there's a deep harmonizing impulse at the basis of the Upanishads, especially at the basis of the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavan Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita, again and again, it's trying to say, the path of knowledge is great, but so is the path of karma, and that can also take you to the same goal. What about the path of bhakti? That's also great. What about the path of dhyana, meditation? That's also great, chapter 6. So Swami Vivekananda says, in order to understand the harmonizing structure of these Vedantic scriptures, the broadness of the original Vedantic scriptures, you need the example of somebody who is equally broad and equally harmonizing. And who is that in the history of spirituality? Sri Ramakrishna, at least to him, to Swami Vivekananda, and to many others. He's the shining example of somebody who harmonized different spiritual paths, who harmonized different spiritual philosophies. So who is in a better position to interpret these Vedantic scriptures in that original spirit of broadness, in that original harmonizing spirit, than Sri Ramakrishna? And I've started to do this in some of my lectures and also in some of my scholarly articles. I have an article called Toward a New Hermeneutics of the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo, and the Secret of Vijnana. And what I claim there is that in the Bhagavad Gita, in 5 places, Bhagavan Krishna distinguishes 2 terms, jnana and vijnana. And traditional commentators have had a very hard time explaining what jnana and vijnana mean in these contexts. Why this distinction? What exactly is the difference between jnana and vijnana? And what I claim is that Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on jnana and vijnana, which I discussed in my lecture today, provide the key to, can at least help us to understand what Bhagavan Krishna might have meant by jnana and vijnana. And Sri Aurobindo, a great yogi who was influenced by Sri Ramakrishna, wrote a 600-page commentary on the Bhagavad Gita called Essays on the Gita, where I claim he basically uses Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on jnana and vijnana to interpret the terms jnana and vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita, but without, just like blindly or dogmatically reading Sri Ramakrishna's teachings into the Gita, but showing that in the specific context in which those terms occur in the Gita, the best way to interpret these terms are in the sense of Sri Ramakrishna. That jnana stands for realization of the impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness, whereas vijnana is a further and deeper realization of God as both personal and impersonal. So that's just one example, but I can multiply examples of how studying the scriptures in the light of Sri Ramakrishna can actually shed new light on the scriptures and give us a more accurate understanding of the scriptures. Other online questions before we wrap it up? No? Okay. Anyone else here in person? Forever hold your peace? Okay. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.